The wind howled across the high plains, sweeping dust and tumbleweed against the weather-beaten fences of the ranch. Once, this place had been alive with laughter, men calling to each other as they drove the herd, children chasing dogs in the yard, her late husband striding across the corral with his strong voice echoing in the dusk. Now, silence ruled. Silence, and the widow's determined footsteps as she carried on the work of 10 men with her 2 hands. Her name was Clara. The town folk called her the widow at Broken Rock Ranch. She had stopped correcting them years ago. She wasn't ashamed of her loss. Her husband had been a good man, cut down too soon, but she resented being defined by absence. Still, when she rode into town for supplies, she felt the stares, pity from some, suspicion from others. A woman alone on a ranch was a curiosity, and worse, an easy target. Clara bore scars from the fire that had taken part of her barn and her husband in the same cruel night. Her left arm carried a rope of white flesh from shoulder to wrist, and though the wound no longer burned, it marked her as someone touched by tragedy. More than the scar, though, was the hollow in her chest. She worked the land with stubbornness, not joy. Her cattle were fewer each season, and each year it grew harder to hold on to what was rightfully hers. The ranch itself was her anchor. She knew every acre, every rock, every stubborn tuft of grass. In spring, she coaxed life out of the soil. In summer, she fought to keep water in the troughs. In winter, she huddled by the fire and prayed her cattle survived the snow. It was a lonely rhythm, but she clung to it. If she didn't keep moving, if she didn't keep fighting, grief would swallow her whole. That evening, Clara leaned against the corral post, her hat pulled low, watching the fading sun turn the horizon blood red. The cattle lowed in the distance, their numbers painfully small. The land stretched wide and empty around her, and for a moment she felt that emptiness in her bones. She told herself she needed no one. She told herself that love had died with her husband. And yet deep in her chest there was a whisper of longing she dared not name. Trouble was never far. Rustlers had circled her land the year before, stealing calves and leaving her to bury the ranch hand who tried to stop them. Since then, men had appeared at her door with false smiles and greedy eyes, offering to buy her land cheap. She had turned them all away, her rifle always close at hand. But she knew the day might come when her grit alone wouldn't be enough. Clara tightened the knot on the rope she held, repairing the fence with tired fingers. She would hold on to Broken Rock Ranch until her last breath. The land was her legacy, her pride, and the last link to the man she had loved. The sky darkened, stars blinking awake. Clara walked back toward the small cabin that was both home and fortress. She lit the lantern, its warm glow spilling across the rough wooden table. She ate her supper in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Outside, a lone coyote howled, and something in her heart echoed the cry. She was strong, she was unyielding, but she was also alone, and the plains had a way of reminding a body of just how wide and how empty life could be. The next morning broke hard and bright, the kind of day where the sun seemed merciless and the chores stretched on like a punishment. Clara was already outside before dawn, her boots crunching on frosted grass, a bucket of feed in one hand and her rifle slung over the other. She had long ago learned to move fast and quiet, to watch the horizon for danger. Her land demanded both. That was when she saw the rider. A dark figure appeared at the far edge of the property, a lone cowboy on horseback. The stallion's gait was slow but steady, its rider hunched with the weariness of a man who'd ridden through the night. Clara's first instinct was suspicion. Men didn't come riding up to her ranch with good intentions. Not anymore. She set the feed bucket down and gripped her rifle tight. By the time the rider reached her front gate, Clara was leaning against the post, barrel pointed toward him. "State your business," she called out, voice sharp as barbed wire. The cowboy raised a hand in peace, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. His clothes were worn from trail dust, his boots scuffed, his duster torn at the sleeve. Still, there was something in the way he sat tall in the saddle that spoke of quiet strength. "Name's Luke," he said finally, his voice low and even. "I'm looking for work. Heard tell you might be needing a hand." Clara narrowed her eyes. "You heard wrong. I don't hire drifters. Not asking for charity." His tone didn't rise, didn't flinch. "Just a chance to earn my keep. Got 2 good hands, no cattle, no fences, and I don't spook easy. Your land looks like it could use all 3. The audacity of him almost made her laugh. Almost. Instead, Clara studied him in silence. The truth was, he wasn't wrong. Her fences sagged, her herd was thin, and winter was pressing close. But she'd sooner shoot a man than let him get close enough to take advantage of her weakness. She lifted the rifle a little higher. "And what's stopping me from thinking you're another rustler scouting my place?" Luke met her gaze, steadily, eyes a clear gray that seemed cut from stone. "If I were here to take from you, ma'am, I'd have come in the dark and not asked permission. Ain't my way." Something in his calm unsettled her more than if he'd begged. This was a man used to hard miles and harder truths. Still, trust wasn't something Clara handed out like feed corn. "You'll take meals outside. You'll sleep in the barn. And if I catch you looking at more than cattle, I'll send you off with lead in your back," she said firmly. The corner of his mouth tugged up, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "Fair terms." She lowered the rifle a fraction, though not enough to be friendly. He swung off his horse, moving with the ease of someone who'd lived more in the saddle than on solid ground. His horse, a bay with scars of its own, dropped, its head gratefully toward the water trough. Clara watched, torn between relief at the possibility of help and irritation at his quiet confidence. Men like him had a way of leaving trouble behind, or carrying it with them. She didn't know yet which kind Luke was. Still, when he carried his saddle toward the barn, she didn't stop him. For the first time in a long while, the ranch didn't feel entirely hers to shoulder alone. And though she told herself she'd regret it, deep down a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this cowboy's arrival was the beginning of something she hadn't dared hope for in years. The first week with Luke on the ranch was a test, for him, but mostly for Clara. She didn't trust easily, and she made sure he knew it. Every chore she gave him was half work, half trial. Fixing the sagging south fence, mucking the barn, hauling, feed bags from the supply shed. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, waiting for him to slack, complain, or show his true colors. But Luke never did. He worked in silence, sweat dripping down his brow, his movements steady and efficient. He didn't cut corners, didn't ask foolish questions, and when she barked at him, he only tipped his hat and carried on. That infuriated her more than if he'd talked back. At supper, she kept her word. He ate outside, sitting on an upturned barrel with his plate balanced on his knees. She sat alone at her kitchen table, listening to the night sounds, the scrape of his fork, the quiet murmur. He gave his horse as he bedded it down, the low whistle of a tune that reminded her faintly of lullabies. She never joined him, and he never asked. Yet despite her caution, she began to notice things. The way he checked the herd before bedding down, running a careful hand along the flanks of a calf with a limp. The way he moved through her barn as, though it were his own, stacking hay bales neatly, mending a door hinge without being asked. He was no green drifter. This was a man who had once known land, cattle, and responsibility. Still, she didn't let her guard slip. One afternoon, Clara caught him leaning against the corral rail, watching the horizon as though searching for something far away. She stiffened instantly. "You're not paid to daydream," she snapped. He didn't turn his head. Ain't paid at all yet. The retort made her bristle, though his tone wasn't sharp, just plain spoken. She marched past him, slamming the gate closed harder than necessary. Then maybe you'd best find wages elsewhere. At that, his eyes flicked toward her, gray and steady. If I wanted elsewhere, I'd be there. The words hung between them, heavier than they had any right to be. Clara busied herself with coiling rope, her cheeks hot, though she couldn't say why. She didn't want him here. She didn't want to need him. And yet, the ranch looked tidier, the herd calmer, and the fences stronger after only a week under his hands. That night, a storm rolled over the plains. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked the earth, and the cattle bawled in fear. Clara pulled on her boots, ready to face the chaos alone. She always did. But when she reached the corral, Luke was already there, his slicker plastered to his shoulders, his voice low and even as he coaxed the animals back from panic. Together they worked in the downpour, mud sucking at their boots, rain blinding their eyes. For hours they fought the storm and the herd, neither sparing words, only moving in rhythm like partners long practiced. By the time the thunder passed and the herd settled, both of them were soaked and shaking from cold. Clara leaned against the fence, breathless, strands of wet hair plastered to her scarred cheek. Luke stood nearby, equally drenched, hat dripping like a river. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. In the flash of moonlight breaking through the clouds, she felt something she hadn't in years. Acknowledgement, not pity. But just as quickly, she turned away. "Don't think this means I trust you," she said, voice hoarse from rain and exhaustion. Luke gave a small nod, adjusting his hat. "Didn't. Expect you would, ma'am." And with that, the uneasy companionship continued. Two people circling each other like wary wolves, working the same ground, each unwilling to admit how much they had already begun to rely on the other. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch washed clean and silver under the moon. For days afterward, Clara found herself replaying that night, the way Luke's voice had steadied the cattle, the way his presence had steadied her. She didn't like how easily his calm slipped into her world. It was dangerous to lean on anyone. Dangerous to remember what it felt like not to carry the weight alone. She kept her distance, but Luke had a way of uncovering truths without prying. He didn't push her with questions, yet his silence often stretched so long it made her feel as if the air itself were waiting for her to speak. It was during a late evening chore, mending the barn roof, that her defenses cracked. She was up, on the ladder, hammering shingles into place when the hammer slipped from her hand. Instinctively, she reached out with her scarred arm. The skin stretched, the old burn twisting white under strain. She hissed in pain. Luke was at the bottom of the ladder before she could recover. "You all right?" I said. "I don't need help," she snapped, more fiercely than the moment required. But his gaze had already landed on her arm. In the lantern, light, the scars glared angry and uneven, running from wrist to shoulder like a cruel brand. Clara's heart thudded. Most folks pretended not to notice, their eyes flicking away in polite discomfort. Luke didn't. He looked steady and unflinching, as though memorizing every jagged line. She climbed down from the ladder, her voice shaking with fury. "Don't stare! I ain't staring." His tone was quiet, but it struck deep. "Just seeing what you've carried." The words nearly undid her. Clara turned away sharply, shoulders rigid. Memories she kept buried rose like ghosts. The barn fire, the screams of cattle trapped inside, her husband rushing into the blaze to drive them out. She had tried to follow, had grabbed the rope to pull the burning door open, and the flames had lashed her arm like a whip. She still smelled the smoke in her dreams, still woke hearing his cry as the roof gave way. "Scars don't make you weak," Luke said behind her. Clara's throat tightened. You don't know a damn thing about me. You're right. He paused. But I know a thing or two about living with ghosts. Something in his voice stopped her cold. It wasn't pity. He didn't offer that. It was recognition, as though he too carried invisible wounds. She swallowed hard, her breath uneven. The fire took more than my arm. Took my husband, my best hand, half my herd. Left me with nothing but whispers behind my back and men circling. Like buzzards waiting for me to fall? Her confession startled even herself. She hadn't meant to share it, but once the words tumbled free, she couldn't take them back. Luke stepped closer, but not too close. And still you're standing, still fighting for this land. Clara barked a bitter laugh. Fightin'. Don't bring him back. No. But it honors him. Honors you. For a long moment, the barn was silent except for the soft nicker of a horse settling into straw. Clara's shoulders sagged, the weight of her loneliness pressing heavier than the hammer she had dropped. Luke didn't touch her. Didn't offer empty promises. He only stood with her in the quiet, his presence a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she believed. It was then Clara realized. This cowboy was not just a drifter. He was a man with shadows of his own. And though she told herself never to open her heart again, a fragile part of her wondered what it might mean to share those wounds with someone who understood. The days grew shorter, the air sharper with the bite of autumn. Work on the ranch left little time for words, but silence between Clara and Luke was no longer hostile. It had shifted, become a space where truth could settle, heavy but unspoken. Still, Clara sensed Luke carried something he had yet to reveal. He bore himself like a man used to command, yet chose the role of a hired hand. One evening, after a long day of driving cattle back from a broken fence line, they sat outside beneath the stars. Clara had brought 2 mugs of coffee to the porch, surprising herself with the gesture. Luke accepted his with a nod, sitting on the step while she leaned against the rail. For a while they drank in silence. The sky was vast, scattered with silver stars, the kind of sight that made a person feel both small and infinite at once. Luke cradled the mug in his hands, as though it were warmer than the fire inside him. Funny thing about land, he said, finally. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the night. You think it's yours to keep, but truth is, it just lets you borrow it for a while, lose your grip, and it don't hesitate to move on to another man. Clara studied him carefully. Sounds like a man speaking from experience. He gave a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Had a spread once, near Amarillo. 200 head of prime cattle, good pasture, and a cabin I built with my own hands. His eyes darkened, fixed on some point far away. Thought, I had the world by the reins. What happened? The question slipped out before Clara could stop herself. Luke hesitated, then exhaled slow. Cards, whiskey, and trust in the wrong sort of men. Lost near everything at a poker table one night. Some of it fair, most of it not. By the time I saw the truth, the deed was already signed over. Sheriff called it legal. I called it a theft. Clara's heart tightened. She imagined the sting of such loss, the emptiness of watching your life's work vanish in a single night. Could have fought to get it back. He continued, his voice edged with regret. But the fight would have cost blood, and I'd already seen too much of that in the war. So I saddled up and rode. Been riding since. Clara was silent, the night air thick between them. At last she asked softly, Why come here then? To my land? Luke lifted his gaze to hers, the fire in his eyes startling in its rawness. Because I was looking for something worth staying for. Something a man can't gamble away. The word struck her harder than any confession could. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She told herself it was foolish to feel anything. She had sworn off love, sworn off trust. Yet the honesty in his voice pierced the armor she had spent years building. He set his mug down, leaning forward slightly. I ain't proud of what I lost, but I'd trade every herd I ever owned if it meant one night of peace in arms that don't see me as less than what I was." Clara's pulse quickened. She wanted to scoff, to push him away with sharp words, but her tongue betrayed her, caught between the ache of grief and the longing she tried to deny. Luke didn't move closer, didn't press her. He simply laid his truth in the open, as a man lays down his last card, knowing it may win or lose him everything. And in that moment, Clara realized, this drifter was not seeking her land, her cattle, or her protection. He was seeking her. And that terrified her more than any rustler ever could. The peace on Broken Rock Ranch didn't last. Clara had known it couldn't. The plains had a way of testing the strong, and nothing stayed untouched by trouble for long. It began with tracks. Luke found them first. Hoof prints cutting across the far pasture, too many for stray cattle, too fresh for old trails. He crouched low, brushing his fingers over the churned dirt. "Rustlers," he muttered, eyes narrowing. Clara's stomach tightened. She remembered the last time. The night her husband died trying to drive thieves off their land, the fire that had taken half her herd and marked her for life. She gripped the fence post hard, willing herself not to shake. "They'll be back," Luke said. His voice wasn't panicked, only matter of fact. "Scouting now, testing your fences. When they come again, it'll be with numbers." "I can handle it," Clara said quickly, too quickly. Luke looked at her, long and steady. "You don't have to." But that was exactly what she feared, depending on someone else. Depending meant risking loss. 2 nights later, the proof came. Just after sundown, the herd grew restless, lowing and stamping. Clara grabbed her rifle. Rushing out to the corral, shadows moved in the distance, shapes slipping like wolves across the open field. Then came the crack of a gunshot, sharp and echoing. "Stay behind me," Luke ordered, striding forward. "I'll not cower in my own yard," Clara shot back, raising her rifle. Her voice wavered, but her hands were steady. The rustlers emerged, 5 men on horseback, their faces half hidden under bandanas. The leader's voice carried across the dark. "Widow, you can't hold this land. Sell now and save yourself the trouble." Clara's blood boiled. "This land's mine, and you'll get it over my dead body." The leader chuckled. "That can be arranged." Before he could signal, Luke stepped forward, shotgun leveled. "Best think twice," he drawled. "You boys ride in here and not all of you'll ride back out." The standoff stretched thin, like a rope ready to snap. Clara's heart hammered. She could feel the weight of Luke's presence beside her, solid as stone. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel alone facing the danger. The rustlers hesitated, muttering among themselves. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt. "This ain't over. We'll be back." With a sharp tug of the reins, he wheeled his horse and disappeared into the night, the others following like shadows swallowed by the plains. Silence fell, broken only by the frightened lowing of cattle. Clara let out a shaky breath, lowering her rifle. Her body trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of memory. Luke holstered his weapon, eyes scanning the horizon as if to be certain they were truly gone. Then he turned to her. "You can't face 'em by yourself, Clara, not this time." She stiffened, her pride rising. "I've faced worse." He shook his head. "Not alone you haven't, and you won't again, not while I'm here." The words cut deeper than she expected, stirring something fierce and fragile inside her. She wanted to argue, to remind him she had survived this long without a man's protection. But the truth was there in her racing pulse, in the trembling of her hands. She wasn't as unbreakable as she pretended. For the rest of the night, Luke patrolled the perimeter, his figure a dark sentinel against the starlight. Clara watched him from the porch, torn between gratitude and fear. Gratitude that he had stood firm at her side, fear that she was beginning to rely on him, and deep inside, where she barely dared admit it. A flicker of something else stirred, hope. The rustlers didn't wait long to make good on their threat. Within the week, Clara and Luke awoke to the low, panicked bawling of cattle and the thunder of hooves. The thieves had returned, this time in force. Clara snatched her rifle from beside the door, heart pounding. Luke was already pulling on his boots, his face grim and set. Outside, lantern light caught the dust and shadows of half a dozen mounted men driving her herd toward the open prairie. "They're after the calves," Luke said sharply, already striding toward the barn. "If they take them, you'll lose." The herd inside of 2 seasons. Clara followed close, fury burning through her fear. "Not while I'm breathing." Luke saddled his horse in record time and thrust the reins of another into Clara's hands. "You can shoot from the saddle?" Her jaw clenched. "I've had practice." They rode hard, the night wind tearing at their clothes, the ground shaking beneath their horses. Clara's pulse roared in her ears, but her grip on the reins was steady. She had faced loss before. Tonight, she would fight for what was hers. The rustlers drove the herd toward a ravine, hoping to scatter them into chaos. Luke cut across the flank, firing a warning shot into the air. The thieves cursed, veering aside as one of the calves bolted back toward Clara's horse. She leaned low, guiding it back to the main herd with the ease of someone who knew cattle better than men. Gunfire cracked. Dirt sprayed near her boots. Clara ducked, her heart slamming against her ribs. Luke returned fire, not wild but precise. Each shot measured. One rustler cried out, falling from his horse with a curse. The others pulled back slightly, no longer so bold in the face of his aim. Clara pressed on, her rifle snug against her shoulder. She fired once, the recoil jarring through her scarred arm, but her shot hit true, splintering the wagon wheel they'd planned to use as a blockade. The rustlers' plan unraveled. "Drive 'em back to the corral!" Luke shouted. Together they turned the herd, Clara hollering, Luke whistling sharp commands. Side by side, they pushed against chaos until the cattle obeyed, hooves churning but no longer scattering. The rustlers shouted in frustration, their leader spurring his horse forward. "You can't hold this land, widow," he bellowed. "So, what if you've got a hired gun at your side? We'll come again and again, until it's ours." Clara raised her rifle, the lantern light glinting off her scarred face. "Then you'd best dig graves for every try because I'm not giving it up." Her words rang across the open plain, carried by a strength she hadn't felt since her husband died. Luke glanced at her, a flicker of respect, and something deeper in his eyes. The leader spat in the dirt, then wheeled his horse back. One by one, the rustlers retreated, disappearing into the dark. The herd settled, milling nervously but intact. Clara slid from her horse, her legs trembling as the adrenaline ebbed. Luke dismounted beside her, scanning the horizon. "They'll lick their wounds, but they'll think twice before riding this way again." She exhaled shakily, wiping sweat and dirt from her brow. "I swore I'd never go through another night like this." "You didn't," Luke said quietly. "Not alone." The simple truth in his words pierced deeper than the rustler's bullets. Clara realized she had stood not just as a widow guarding her land, but as part of something stronger, 2 people bound by grit, facing the storm together. And though the night air was cold, she felt warmth spark deep inside, a heat that had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do with the man beside her. The ranch was quiet after the fight, but it wasn't the kind of quiet Clara had grown used to over the years. It wasn't hollow silence or the gnawing loneliness of empty rooms. This quiet carried the echo of gunfire, the pounding of hooves, and the heavy truth that for the first time since her husband's death, she hadn't stood alone against the dark. The cattle had settled, huddled close in the corral, their breaths steaming in the chill night air. Clara and Luke moved among them, checking for injuries. Clara's lantern swung with each step, throwing long shadows across the ground. Luke walked on the other side of the herd, his voice low and steady as he coaxed a skittish calf back toward its mother. When at last the work was done, Clara leaned against the corral rail, exhaustion settling into her bones. Her scarred arm throbbed from firing her rifle, her throat burned from shouting. Still, she felt a strange sense of strength humming in her chest. Luke came to stand beside her, his hat pulled low, his shirt dark with sweat and dust. For a long while, neither spoke. The stars were bright above them, glittering sharp as diamonds, and the night air smelled of rain-soaked earth. "You handled yourself out there," Luke said at last, his voice quiet but sure. Clara gave a rough laugh. "Handled myself, maybe, but I'm not fool enough to think I could have done it without you." He glanced at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the lantern light. "You would have fought him off one way or another. You've got more grit than any man I've ever met." The words lodged deep inside her, sparking something she hadn't felt in years, pride that wasn't twisted with grief, a reminder that her scars didn't make her weak. She looked away quickly, unwilling to let him see how much it meant. "You stayed," she said after a moment, softer now. "Most men wouldn't." Luke leaned his arms on the fence rail, his posture easy, but his words weighted. "I ain't most men. When I say I'll stand, I stand." The simple truth of it hit her harder than any declaration of love could have. For so long, Clara had built her world on suspicion, expecting betrayal at every turn. Yet this man, a drifter, with nothing to his name, had fought beside her as if the ranch were his own. She studied him in silence, lantern light tracing the hard lines of his face, the tired set of his shoulders. He wasn't handsome in the polished way some men were, but there was a steadiness in him, a strength that reached beyond the surface. And against her better judgment, Clara felt her heart stir. "You should rest," she said finally, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will come quick." Luke gave a small nod but didn't move, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though still guarding against threats. Clara turned toward the house, but after a few steps she paused. "Luke." He lifted his head. "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried all the weight of her gratitude, the relief of not fighting alone, the quiet balm of having someone share the burden. Luke tipped his hat slightly. "Don't thank me, Clara. Just means I did what any decent man ought," she almost laughed at that, because she knew better. Decent men were few, and fewer still stayed when the fight grew bloody. Inside the house, as Clara lit the lantern and set it on the table, she caught her reflection in the window, scarred, weary, but softened by something new. Hope. She tried to chase it away, reminding herself that hope could be dangerous. But as she lay down that night, the echo of Luke's steady voice followed her into sleep. The rustlers hadn't returned, but their shadow lingered. Days on Broken Rock Ranch carried on, feeding cattle, mending fences, hauling water, but something in the rhythm had changed. Clara no longer woke each morning bracing herself for the weight of solitude. Luke was there, steady as the rising sun, his presence woven into every corner of the ranch. She tried to tell herself it was temporary. He was a drifter. Men like him didn't stay. And yet each night when she set 2 plates instead of 1, each morning when she saw him saddle his horse before dawn, something deep inside her stirred. Dangerous, aching, alive. It was after supper, one evening, the sky painted with the last strokes of twilight, that Luke finally spoke the words that had been building between them. Clara was clearing the table, her scarred hand trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. Luke sat at the far end, his coffee untouched, his gray eyes shadowed with thought. He looked as though he were wrestling something fierce inside himself. "Clara," he said at last, his voice low, weighted. She froze, her back to him, the plate in her hands slick with soap. Something in his tone told her this was no ordinary talk. She set the dish aside and turned slowly. Luke rose, his tall frame filling the room. He stood there a moment, hat in his hands, the silence thick as smoke. Finally, he met her eyes. "I've been riding a long time," he began. "Lost more than I can name. Land, cattle, kin. Thought I was a man without a place, without a reason to stop." Clara's throat tightened, but she said nothing. His jaw worked as though the words hurt to shape. "But standing beside you, fighting for this ranch, fighting for something that matters, it reminded me what I once had, and what I've been searching for ever since." Her heart pounded. She wanted to step back, to put space between them, but her feet betrayed her, rooted to the floor. Then his voice softened, ragged at the edges. "Clara, I'd trade 10 herds. Hell, I'd trade everything I ever owned just for one night in your arms." The words fell like a brand in the silence, searing, undeniable. He wasn't asking for pity nor bargaining for her land. It was a confession stripped bare of pride, a man laying down his last card with nothing left to lose. Clara's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt, memory and longing colliding in her chest. For years she had locked her heart away, certain no man could touch it again, yet here he was, this drifter with haunted eyes, offering her not promises of forever, but the truth of his need. She turned her face away, ashamed of the tears stinging her eyes. "You don't understand what you're asking. I buried my husband on this land. I've carried scars no man wants to touch. I'm not a woman men whisper sweet words to, Luke." "I ain't whispering," he said firmly. "I'm telling you plain. You're stronger than any woman I've known, braver than any man. And I don't see scars when I look at you, Clara. I see the fire that kept this place alive." Her defenses wavered, trembling like a fence in the wind. She wanted to say no, to push him back behind the walls she'd built. But deep inside, a voice whispered the truth. She wanted what he offered. Not his land, not his past, but the fierce honesty in his eyes. The air between them pulsed, heavy with everything unsaid. And though she said nothing, the way her hands clenched against her skirts, the way her breath hitched, told him she had heard. For the first time in years, Clara was faced not with the question of survival, but with the risk of surrender. The night after Luke's confession stretched long and restless for Clara. She lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, her scarred hand resting over her racing heart. His words haunted her. "I'd trade 10 herds, just for one night in your arms." She tried to tell herself it was reckless, foolish. Men came and went, especially men like Luke, who carried the road in his blood. But his voice had carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Not desperation, not lust alone, but something truer, deeper. He had bared his soul, and in doing so, he'd forced her to face her own. At dawn, Clara rose before the rooster crowed. She lit the lantern in the kitchen, set water to boil, and tried to lose herself in the rhythm of chores. But her hands trembled as she kneaded bread, and she found herself glancing toward the barn every few moments, knowing he would be there, and he was. When she stepped outside, pale gold light spilling over the horizon, Luke was already saddling the horses. His broad back was straight, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was giving her space, but he was waiting for her answer. Clara swallowed hard and walked toward him, her boots crunching on the frosted grass. He turned at the sound, his hat brim shadowing his eyes, but she felt his gaze sharpen as it fell on her. Neither spoke for a long moment. The air between them was thick with everything left unsaid. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "You turned my world upside down last night, Luke." He shifted, his hands pausing on the saddle strap. "Didn't mean to trouble you, Clara. I only thought you ought to know the truth." Her throat tightened. The truth is, I haven't let myself feel in a long time. I thought love died with him. Thought my scars would keep every man at arm's length. Luke stepped closer, slow, careful, as though approaching a skittish mare. And now? She met his eyes, steady despite the tremor in her chest. Now I see a man standing beside me, a man who fought for this ranch like it was his own, a man who looks at me and doesn't see what I lost, but what I am. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to soften, to hope. She reached out, her scarred hand trembling as it brushed against his arm. Luke caught it gently, his rough palm engulfing hers, his thumb tracing the ridges of her scars as though they were something precious. "Clara," he said, his voice husky, "I don't want your land. I don't want your cattle. I just want you. Whether it's for a night or a lifetime, that's the truth of it." Her eyes burned, but she didn't look away. Instead, she stepped into him, closing the space between them. His breath mingled with hers, warm in the morning chill. For the first time in so long, Clara let herself lean into someone's arms, not out of weakness, but out of choice. When his lips found hers, it was not a desperate kiss, but a steady one, like a promise. The world around them seemed to still, the cattle lowing in the distance, the rising sun spilling light across Broken Rock Ranch. When they parted, Clara rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Then stay," she whispered, "not just tonight." "Stay!" Luke's arms tightened around her, his voice low but sure. "Darling, I was never planning to leave." And as the dawn rose higher, painting the sky with fire, Clara realized that the long, lonely nights were over. The ranch was still hers, the land still demanding. But now she would face it not as a widow clinging to survival, but as a woman with a partner at her side. A new dawn, a new beginning. And in Luke's arms, Clara finally found the home her heart had been waiting for.